So I developed an academic interest in this topic around 2015, which was a year marked by like several incidents of violence against doctors and other healthcare personnel. Such incidents were not new then, and they have continued to occur even after. This photograph, for example, is from 2017, when some doctors decided to register their protest against violence by wearing motorcycle helmets to work. What I will focus on today is one particular aspect of the discussions and debates which invariably accompany such incidents of violence, namely the claim that the patient doctor relationship in India was highly cordial and trustful sometime in the past, and that it began deteriorating mostly or only in the 1980s and 1990s, especially after large hospitals run in the style of corporations appeared on the healthcare scene. For example, in 2017, a senior doctor wrote, in quotes, "In the early years after independence, medicine was regarded as a good profession. Doctors were respected and well paid," end quote. This kind of fond remembrance of a past era when doctors supposedly enjoyed enormous public trust and affection has been a hallmark of doctors' writings at least since the 1990s. In 1997, the Indian pediatrician Meherban Singh expressed displeasure over the weakening public image of doctors and said that medicine is no longer considered a divine task of allaying sufferings of ailing humanity. Many such writings of doctors and other commentators portray the early post-independence decades, that is the period roughly from the 1950s to the 1970s, as one marked by almost uniformly friendly and respectful patient-doctor interactions. In some such narratives, this period is considered a golden era for the medical profession. So in my presentation today, I will investigate this purported golden era with a historical lens. In other words, I will attempt to take us to this period and recreate some aspects of the medical and healthcare world which existed then. To start with, it must be noted that a quick look at the conventional archives and primary sources certainly provides a sense of some form of a golden era. For example, we'll see that the mainstream discourse is characterized by the constant use of the phrase noble profession to denote doctors and their calling. The phrase was commonly employed by doctors in their writings and in addresses to students and new graduates. In a convocation address in 1954 to young postgraduate students, S.L. Bhatia, who was the former dean of Bombay's Grant Medical College, told them that they were entering, in quotes, the noblest of all professions. Politicians and journalists also invoked this noble profession phrase and similar phrases. Besides, many political elites in the 1950s considered the medical profession to be an important partner in development and nation building. Apart from this discourse, the portrayal of doctors in popular culture also showcased a positive public image of the profession. Popular novels and plays and a number of popular movies in the 1940s to 60s showed doctors primarily as male, sacrificing, selfless members of the society, working hard to make helpful contributions to the new Indian nation and its poverty-stricken public. It must be remembered, however, that while these conventional sources do tell a good story, it is only a small part of the larger story. It must also be noted that these sources almost exclusively preserve and transmit the experiences and perceptions of only doctors and other elites, especially the professional urban middle class, which included journalists, writers, filmmakers, etc. Going beyond these sources helps open up many new ways of thinking about doctors and patients. What is revealed is a far more complex picture of what patients and the public in general thought about doctors. These additional archives I have used in my research include newspaper reports, editorials, letters to the editor, legislative discussions at the state and union levels, administrative files of government health departments, and most importantly, the writings of anthropologists and sociologists who lived and worked in different parts of India in the 1950s and 1960s. In the absence of direct accounts from patients themselves, especially underprivileged patients with little access to influence any kind of public discourse, these sources provide an important, even if still incomplete, overview of patient-doctor interactions in the early post-independence decades. I will present here a short survey of some of the key findings from these sources. Since biomedicine took different trajectories in urban and rural India, it is convenient to employ the broad rural-urban distinction when analyzing public perceptions. With respect to rural India, the most important point, which seems to have been missed in later commentaries, is that only a small proportion of biomedical doctors ever lived and practiced in villages, and that only a small number of villagers ever chose to go or were able to go to doctors and their clinics. In the early 1950s, for example, anthropologist Makim Marriott observed that villagers in northern India were aware of biomedicine, but that it was not their most common or most sought after option. In a village in southern India, sociologist S.C. Dubey observed that the local dispensary was utilized only occasionally, especially since it lacked proper equipment and a qualified medical practitioner. During the survey of villages in Western India, um, social scientist Y.B. Damle was told by the doctor at a local dispensary that, in his opinion, only 20% of the villagers came to him for treatment. Researchers also noticed that in rural regions, biomedicine was often disproportionately availed of by persons of the privileged castes. In a northern Indian village, some researchers observed that persons of, in quotes, the higher castes often went to biomedical centers in neighboring large urban centers. In a Bengal village, an anthropologist observed that 8 privileged caste families regularly gave calls to a local doctor, that is, requested him to come for home visits. This expensive luxury, of course, could not be afforded either economically or even socially by most other residents of the village. It is important to note why there existed such caste-based discrepancy in the use of biomedicine in many parts of rural India. Usually, the case was that many persons from historically oppressed castes and communities believed, for good reason, that they would not be welcome at public dispensaries or private clinics, which were frequented by members of the dominant castes. They thought that they might be driven out if they went there. Besides, in case that they were indeed, in quotes, allowed, they felt obliged to pay some fees, even if the dispensary or clinic offered free treatment in general. The restriction on Dalits and Adivasis to freely use public spaces was, of course, centuries old, and specifically in terms of biomedical hospitals and dispensaries, became a common feature in the early 1900s, as this testimony by B.R. Ambedkar and P.G. Solanki shows. Most doctors in India during this time belonged to privileged caste groups. The fact that a number of them often indulged in casteist discriminatory practices also contributed to the disparities in access. In January 1951, for example, a telegram from the Depressed Classes League, which was another term for Dalits during that time, mentioned, this was a northwestern province, mentioned an incident where a Dalit woman had been, in quotes, crudely treated and forcibly expelled from a hospital by a lady doctor. And it had caused great resentment among the Dalits of the region. Such disrespectful behavior of some doctors toward Dalit and Adivasi patients also went back to the colonial period. One might mention here an incident of casteism recorded in Mohandas Gandhi's weekly journal, Young India. This happened in the 1920s in a Gujarat village where a doctor refused to touch and examine a Dalit woman who was suffering most probably from puerperal sepsis, and she died soon after. Of course, all such interactions took place where there were biomedical doctors in the vicinity, but considering that the majority of doctors lived and practiced in cities and big towns, it can be said that for a large proportion of the rural Indian populace, doctors were a highly uncommon entity. And indeed, many would have lived their whole lives without ever encountering one. As against in rural India, doctors were a prominent community in cities and bigger towns. Here, people's access to doctors was mainly through the government hospital, the public hospital. Then as now, people frequently complained about basic infrastructural issues in these hospitals like lack of hygiene and overcrowding. Newspapers regularly carried reports on such issues and commented on the need for the state to invest in public health. For urban India, the speeches of elected political leaders sometimes provide insights into public perceptions. For example, a member of the Bombay Legislative Assembly said in 1957 that people do not like to go to government hospitals. In 1954, the health minister of the Patiala and East Punjab States Union talked about common public complaints against government hospitals and doctors, which included the practice of asking poor patients to get their own bandages, cotton wool, and food. He said, in quotes, while costly foreign medicines and other luxuries are made readily available to the most affluent patients, the common man may have to wait in anguish and for days to get his fracture attended to, end quotes. In the 1950s, a social worker complained that that conditions in most of the hospitals in India were unsatisfactory and that the atmosphere of many hospitals lacked the human touch. And as this excerpt from a reader's letter to a newspaper shows, it is unsurprising that the lack of human touch was most acutely felt by persons from the underprivileged or subaltern castes. So what is clear to me from these and other historical sources is that while later doctors and commentators have characterized the early post-independence period as one in which doctors largely were treated with respect and considered trustworthy, this dominant narrative does not take into account two important aspects, among many others. Firstly, as I mentioned, for a majority of Indians during this time, particularly those in villages, the biomedical doctor was either an uncommon or a non-existent phenomenon. Secondly, with respect to the interactions which doctors did have with people, most commonly in urban public hospitals, these were marked by immense diversity and complexity of experiences and cannot be described in simple uniform characterizations. The experience of subaltern Indians, who form the vast majority of the country's people, cannot be considered wholesale as uniformly and consistently positive, something which we see being done consistently today. Of course, this was not the case with the experiences of elite Indians, and I'm happy to talk more about it during the Q&A session. So as a general rule, it is always helpful to interrogate our received wisdom and oft repeated but never properly tested claims. In terms of the received wisdom regarding the patient-doctor relationship, when we go beyond the conventional archives, which mostly privilege the voices and experiences of the elite, we begin to move toward a more comprehensive, even if never fully complete, picture of people's experiences with doctors. Such a picture tells us, for example, that the subaltern individuals who came in contact with a doctor encountered, first and foremost, an immense asymmetry of power, not just the usual literacy and class-based power, but more importantly, in the Indian setting, caste-based power. Such power asymmetry would have made it difficult for patients to register a protest or complaint if the interaction were unsatisfactory. like, for example, a doctor brusquely examining them and handing over some scribbled prescription. At the same time, the power asymmetry also meant that most subaltern patients invariably displayed outward deference to doctors in individual interactions. In this context, the phrase Dr. Sahab assumes unique significance. While to most doctors, this term denoted an acknowledgement of their special status as skilled and trusted professionals, to many patients, it often simply denoted a ritualized acknowledgement of the class and caste status of doctors and of their status as agents of the government or of the urban elite. That is, a patient might have displayed deference to a doctor and called them Sahab, but might still have lacked faith in the doctor's specific approach and treatment. At the same time, we should remember that many people only rarely went to doctors and usually had their own local indigenous healers and providers with whom they shared a more equal and frequently trustworthy relationship. An important way to look at these phenomena is provided by sociologists Urfeld and Lindbergh. They were social scientists who lived in a village in Madras um, in 1969-70 and studied people's reactions to the introduction of biomedicine. They wrote that modern medical doctors were considered by the villagers as representatives of an alien culture, and doctors derived their status not from medical or technical abilities, but from the culture they represent. They are equals to the masters who run the country and the white masters who once ran it. So this was the quote from their book. Socially and economically, doctors were thus extremely distant from the vast majority of their compatriots and had more in common with the minority of India's elites. As sociologist Roger Jeffrey wrote in 1977, the natural habitat of the doctor in India is the westernized middle class of the cities. With social hierarchies in general and caste in particular being central to interpersonal relationships and attitudes in India, it is not difficult to infer that for a vast majority of people, the primary identity of most doctors would have been that of an elite sahab and not of a friendly, trustworthy healer. The socio-economic hierarchy ensured deference to doctors, but not necessarily trust. While a minority of individual doctors might certainly have enjoyed such trust and respect, such doctors remained a minority and could not have influenced broader public attitudes toward the larger medical profession. So, in summary, trust in doctors was already diffuse, volatile, and contingent when radical changes in India's healthcare began to take place in the 1980s and 1990s, including the proliferation of for-profit corporate style hospitals. Here, it is also important to remember that the medical profession's enthusiastic participation in coercive sterilization camps and other invasive family planning procedures in the 1970s had additionally alienated many subaltern people and communities. It is incorrect to assume, thus, a clear and sharp break between a romanticized pre-1980s era and a post-1980s period. It is the continuities which I think are more important than such a hypothetical break. Most significant being the persistence of a vast socioeconomic distance between an elite medical profession on the one hand and their subaltern patient community on the other. This distance has ensured that the mainstream medical profession, barring a smaller group of progressive and reformist doctors, mostly inhabits a social bubble which is greatly removed from the majority of the public and their experiences. In such a scenario, it is unsurprising that what mainstream doctors imagine their past to be is vastly different from how a large majority of people experienced this past. So yeah, that is my presentation. Thank you. And I look forward to the discussion.
Amazing. Thanks. Thanks so much, Kiran. So I guess just a reminder to folks, this is very casual, as in please feel free to come off mute if you have questions. If you're a little bit shy, you can also put them in the chat and I can read them off for you.
I can kick us off with a question. Thank you, Kiran, for a wonderful presentation. Very insightful and obviously, like, I think, I guess my question is, within the health system, whether we are thinking about, say, from our point of view as a public health organization or a clinical care delivery organization, or however it might be, how would you go about sort of inculcating some of the things that you've thought of and learned in terms of all these insights, and kind of holding that against, as you say, the common narrative, right, around how doctors are perceived, and we're still in obviously situations where many organizations are drawn from the same groups that we are talking about. So how would you sort of think through this scenario in terms of better appreciating the dynamics, the interplay, right? Not just in a historical context, but like today.
Yeah, thank you, Arjun. So yeah, like my main kind of goal for a long time just has been like trying to understand what was the past like. And so I'm still like thinking about how to use that, or like apply that knowledge to the present. So like some of the thoughts that just come off the top of my head are, I think, yeah, it would be important to learn about privilege. So if that's something that could be done in medical colleges and even in policy making circles, that most of the people who inhabit these kind of communities and spaces and groups come from like a very particular background, which blinds them to the experiences of a lot of other people and a lot of other communities. So yeah, like hopefully if like the work that I do, the work that a lot of other social scientists do, if that kind of opens up more conversations about understanding and acknowledging and accepting the privilege which a lot of elite policymakers, elite doctors come with, and that can then give rise to introspection and like kind of a better comprehensive understanding of what people need, what the majority of the public needs and it deserves. I think that would be like something that I think will be helpful.
Do you have any reflections of how the increasing number of medical colleges currently will impact on the Indian health system scenario, and also the concept of the abridged version of the medical course? Any insights around that?
Yeah, so in terms of the, thank you for the question. Yeah, in terms of the number of colleges, there have been discussions on that throughout the post-independence period. So yeah, I think a lot of us are, including like in the policy-making circles, we have like this this thing called the doctor population ratio or the doctor patient ratio. And that has dictated a large amount of policy making. And there have been at the same time critics of this approach, like critics of just fixating on that particular ratio and like not looking at the like more comprehensive picture. So yeah, I have like a more sympathetic leaning towards those critics, because the patient population, so the doctor population ratio, as we can see in the name, it just like privileges doctors, and it assumes that if you want to increase or like improve the health standards of a community or of a country, doctors are like the most important entity. Um, and then that kind of like um, just does not give enough justice to a lot of other things which can very well improve health standards, including just like some basic things like providing clean water, providing good housing, access to like sanitation, and also at the same time, all the other healthcare professionals and personnel, apart from doctors, who also contribute to bettering the health standards. So yeah, I am skeptical about the assumption that once we increase the number of medical colleges, once you have more doctors, that is just going to, in a very automatic sense, lead to better health for people. I think that assumption has a lot of flaws. And in any case, the evidence throughout the post-independence period and even prior to that shows that it's just like most doctors do not choose to go to villages. Of course, they have their own reasons, and that can be a whole other discussion. But as long as we have a large amount of a large proportion of population living in places where doctors will most probably not go, it's that again seems a little bit of like misplaced priorities to consider that increasing the number of doctors will lead to improved health. I think your second point was about the abridged version. And if I get it right, I think you're referring to, yeah, like the courses which policymakers are assuming will be taken up by students from villages who will then take the education and go back to the villages. Yeah, it's hard. Like this is also a little bit tricky because we also know through experience that even when like somebody from rural areas takes this kind of like education, they often, if not always, choose to live in cities. And again, that has like many reasons. It's like it's not always helpful to just blame the individuals for that. It's just like the kind of system that we have, which makes it much more convenient and better to practice in certain areas as against other areas. So yeah, like I don't think I have a good sense of like how the abridged version will also help. Yeah, if we are thinking of like what can be called solutions and all, I think, yeah, like the system of ashas that we have based on community health workers, like trying to strengthen that, trying to expand that, trying to like work on that is one thing that can lead to more positive outcomes than any other like solutions. That's what I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I go next? Yeah, thank you, Kiran. I think very in-depth take on this issue. I would like to hear from you on this a topic which is something related but a little different than this. For the past maybe 15 to 20 years in my career, I have been a part of conversations at the center as well as the state levels, where we trying to promote nurses as practitioners, nurses as mentors, and that would also kind of help in this practitioner to patient ratio. I find that though there are some people who do take it forward, there are many who are against it. And in this last, as I said, 15 to 20 years, I find this moving very slowly. only now that we see community, our community clinics or the converted Ayushman Bharat clinics having nurses as practitioners and things like those. So I would like to hear from you. What do you think on this? Having nurses as practitioners and mentors would largely, I believe, help in the skewed doctor practitioner ratio.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm like not very well qualified to answer that question. Of course, I like try to provide what what I can think of. Yeah, I'm completely in agreement with this like general rule that it's not only doctors who have like the right to practice clinical medicine. So I think, I mean, I'm assuming when you said nurses as practitioners, I think you meant like giving nurses like the permission, the power to like prescribe and to like perform some clinical tasks. And if that is helping like expand the access to care to more people, to more communities, to more areas, I think that should be done. And if there is an opposition on the fact that like, well, nurses don't have like their like education does not encompass this or that, and like they do not have like the proper or like in quotes the proper training, I think that's a more like it's just like a superficial kind of opposition, because we know that like with adequate training, nurses can like do a lot of tasks which have, I think, traditionally been like not allowed or not kind of formally permitted. So yeah, my opinion is that if like having nurse practitioners, having nurses as practitioners and mentors helps expand access to more people, I think that should be that should definitely be followed as a solution.
Thank you.
Nilima, I know you had your hand raised earlier, and you also just put something in the chat. Do you want to read it out loud?
Yes. Just basically, one of my earlier questions was also very similar to what Annie had brought up, but just sort of thinking of it from how do you break the cycle of the doctors where, you know, they're sort of being lionized in some sense. Everything is centered around them. And so is the course of medicine being expensive now, whether that's the taxpayer paying for it or whether it's the individual paying for it, ending up having like a direct correlation to doctors taking on like too much more privilege. Like we said, we need to acknowledge privilege, but is there an element of them taking on more privilege than they even began with? Because right now, something that I'm seeing amongst my peers is a lot of arrogance, a lot of thoughts around how they are far more superior and how that, you know, they are sort of the ones that rule the healthcare system and how everything should revolve around them and how they treat their juniors, and whether that means in the same how I get treated by my seniors, and then, you know, how they end up treating the nurses and how my relationship with my juniors looks like. So I'm just saying, like, how do you break this chain? Because it just seems to be going in one big loop.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's an important thing, and of course, no easy answers. But I agree that yes, we have. I mean, I think that's been the case in a lot of countries that biomedical practitioners have been lionized, have been accorded far more kind of like privilege and power, especially as compared to other personnel, other healthcare personnel. And like you mentioned the hierarchies in the medical and healthcare culture between doctors and like students, between doctors and nurses. Um, I think we have to make a beginning somewhere, of course, in terms of like trying to break this cycle and trying to like dilute this kind of lionization that you're talking about. Um, Something that comes to my mind is like the period of the mid 1970s, um, when the idea of community health workers kind of first became very mainstream in the Indian public health in a policy making kind of scenario. Um, and this was like very, very strongly and vehemently opposed by doctors all over. In fact, like when there were like talks of having community health workers in all villages, and choosing these community health workers who would like be people from villages who had like education until I guess like the 8th grade or 6th grade or something like that, and they will be like trained for a few months, and then they would go back to their villages. They will have like a few kind of basic medications that they could prescribe if somebody had fever and all of that. So all of this planning was going on, and there were doctors who were saying, um, I mean, like you mentioned arrogance, and I like there was like a lot of like arrogance in how doctors were reacting to this. They said something like, um, we don't need a population control program when we have these community health workers going to villages. And the implication was that like if you give the right to do some basic clinical practice to these community health workers, they were going to kill people. So maybe the way that the like political leadership reacted to that, and in fact even in kind of like combination with some progressive medical reformers, could be something that could be done, and that is just like ignore. All of this opposition by doctors was ignored, and the community health workers scheme was launched in 1977. It had like it had begun to take shape much earlier, in the like early 1970s, and finally it was like launched in 77, despite all the like opposition from influential medical organizations, including the IMA. So yeah, like if we want to break that like cycle, I think having kind of um, like a political commitment and goal to like um, do that would be like one important first step. And the way I'm seeing now, like the solutions which are being proposed by a lot of government entities still center around doctors. Like they're just like trying to increase the number of medical colleges. They're like saying that we will have more doctors in the future. That I don't think is helpful. That just like, as you said, expands and like augments the lionization. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Akash, do you want to go next?
Hi, Kiran. Akash here. I wanted to digress a little bit, but I think it's an important question, and I wanted your thoughts on it from the medicine side, but it's a pattern that we are seeing everywhere, which is this question of labor and technology. So I wanted to talk about this whole brouhaha around the e-Sanjeevani program and so on and so forth. And the Sanjeevani program falls into a policy history of a country like India where leapfrogging is an obsession since the beginning, right? So the idea is that we are going to skip phases and do something. So in banking, we have this whole UPI stuff that's ongoing. In teaching and education, where the crisis is far more severe, the offer is a $20 billion unicorn startup that's sponsoring the FIFA World Cup, and so on and so forth, right? So what I mean, I have a very half-baked question, but I think what I've found it very interesting is the juxtaposition of what kind of job or what kind of labor is at risk of getting automated versus certain kinds of labor which nobody is invested in automating. So for example, our great country has not been able to automate manual scavenging, right? Because it's cheaper to exploit people than to actually invest in machines which have maintenance, and maintenance implies recurring costs. So almost certainly the state is in violation of its own 1993 legal provisions, which make manual hiring or any kind of promotion. Now, in all of this, now bringing all of us back to the health and nutrition sort of sector, the politicization of the frontline worker is at least relatively in place, right? So just last month we had folks outside NCR, both Haryana and Delhi. I think the Delhi workers are still protesting. Now, how do we sort of think about this in-between figure of paramedics, where the frontline workers, through their sheer size and scale, are able to get some sort of leeway when the pressure is large enough? Doctors, through their political power or social capital, translated into short-term political power whenever needed, like conversion between mechanical energy and potential energy, or potential energy and kinetic energy, are able to handle these short-term issues of payments, like Safdarjung Hospital in Delhi and so on, RML, etc. But what's happened, I think the space with the in-between paramedic staff is neither the frontline worker kind of crazy worker exploitation, nor the very extreme privilege of the doctor folks. So I think, but since I wanted your reflection more on the health side, but what I'm trying to connect is that we are seeing that across the board, right? So we have very senior bureaucrats on record saying that EdTech is the future of education. Now, one of the issues at play here is that teacher is a hard worker to handle, and teacher unions are politically very important. But all evidence on education says that without teacher, you don't have learning outcomes. And no EdTech, no learning outcomes evaluation on EdTech exists. So I wanted to just get your sense on how do we make sense of the larger sociological, macro sociological labor versus, and the last bit, I mean, this is really fresh off the press, is that the Indian Armed Forces are also thinking about hiring contractual workers for 3-year period, which really changes the nature of the game, right? Yeah, thanks. And thanks to others too for patience with my long question.
Yeah, thanks, Akash. Yeah, I think, as you said, it's a half-baked question. I am sure like my reply will also be a little bit half-baked. Yeah, I guess your main focus was on paramedical workers and trying to think of like how we approach them, how we like try to make sense of like their presence in this like medical hierarchy. Yeah, like I unfortunately, again, like I'm like not very well qualified to like answer that or like think about that in like a more comprehensive way. But I think all your points are like very well taken. The fact that we focus on automation only, or like we think about automating only like those kind of jobs which where like, yeah, the power dynamics come into some kind of like, yeah, like align in a way which like favors the elites as against which helps the like subaltern communities. Your example of manual scavenging is spot on. The only thing that comes to my mind is the opposition of doctors to like a lot of automating, which has constantly been proposed over the past, I think, 10 to 20 years. But I would say that at least in that sense, it is better not to have, yeah, exactly as like teachers, we just like it's kind of unthinkable that we want to like automate the jobs that teachers are doing by like not just exactly automate, but yeah, like try to bring ed tech and like just like put the teacher out of the education sector in a big way. Yeah, we should definitely not be doing that. Whether it is with teachers, whether it is with healthcare practitioners, and they could not, they just not are doctors, that also could be nurses, and other practitioners who are like involved in like the intimate care of patients. It will be unfortunate if that kind of trend enters or like becomes big in the healthcare sector. And I also hope that the other sectors which are where the like policymakers are trying to think of these quote unquote solutions, I hope that in some form or the other that like fashion and fad sees the end of the day. But yeah, that will need more kind of like political organizing. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Arif, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible?
Mhm.
Okay. So thank you, Kiran, for your thought-provoking presentation. So I'm not actually going to deal with the directly to the topic, but related to the topic, I'm going to bring up one aspect of this doctor-patient relationship. Although I understand that definitely many of the incidents that led to deteriorating doctor-patient relationships are not really created by the doctors themselves, because they're the part of the systems, and when systems are not working, system flaws are there, that also taken as granted as the doctor's fault, which is actually not the case. But being a doctor and also working with the clinical to some extent, and also the public field for so many years, I understand that we need to look at our medical education, medical curriculum, how this is been set for years together, and also privatization and commercialization of the medical education. And I mean, look at the system. Like if we think that's medical schools or medical colleges, universities will produce a doctor, then look at the ingredients what we are putting into this system. So who can buy this education? And generally speaking, the doctors are not lions, because they have been grown to be the lions by the society itself. So that is not only the doctor's responsibility or the doctor's domain to think as their lions, because they are groomed to be. So there are many societal factors definitely to make things happen this way. But I would like to bring up another point. Doctors are taught to see the patient as a case of tuberculosis, as a case of malignant disease, as a case of diarrhea, as a case of pneumonia, whatsoever, right? But they're not taught that a patient is also a human being. A patient has got his own or her own psychology, has own mental condition, has got own feelings like we people do have. So this is absent in our medical education. So no matter how better the medical education is, the doctors are going to treat the patients, not the human beings, I think. So that is something I think we should be built, and they should be trained in the soft skills of how to deal with the people, how to deal with the situation which make situations which make people agitated, which make people arrogant. Maybe if I am on the other side of the table, how would I have reacted given the situation that my near or loved ones are going through? So these are the aspects that we generally ignore. We think that a doctor who has completed his graduation or master more capable of dealing with the people, but which is really not the case. Thank you.
Thank you for these comments. Yeah, I think all of that makes sense. A lot of that has a longer history. The not just in India, but like in a lot of countries, just like I mean, this is what you're describing is one way or one word which people use to describe it is reductionism. So reductionism is definitely like a big kind of hallmark of the way we think about people in biomedicine. Just like reducing the whole person to like an organ, to like a tissue, to just like one kind of like disease. And this concern with reductionism has been present for a long time. Even in the like 1950s, we had like prominent doctors in India saying the same things, very similar to what you're saying now. Like, yeah, I remember reading some like speech by a doctor in which he said, we have to stop thinking of patients as bed number 14 and 15. Like that was like, again, like a form of stripping away the human factor and just focusing on like whatever the medical textbook and your medical training tells you to focus on. So yeah, like one way to look at it is we have had this critique of the way medical training occurs for a long time, for decades, in fact. And as you can imagine, like the subject of PSM, preventive and social medicine, that was introduced in the medical curriculum also in around the 1950s. That was done especially because at that time, doctors, these like kind of medical leaders thought that all our students are just learning in cities. They just like have no understanding of what goes on in villages, and they have no understanding of preventive medicine. So let's add this to the curriculum. So we have PSM in the medical curriculum since the 1950s, 1960s. We have like these kind of like 1 month rural internships and stuff like that. So yeah, if we think that we should be teaching social skills, soft skills, and all the other things, and if it is assumed that these will help improve like the way doctors behave, the way doctors' attitude is towards their patient, I think we should not put like too much faith in it. Maybe it is good to try, but the experience with PSM, with the experience with community medicine as a subject, with preventive medicine, shows that like just adding something to the curriculum does not necessarily lead to like the desired effect which somebody who proposed that originally was thinking of. So I think all of this like makes a lot of good sense, and it definitely will be helpful to bring these things into the education and training. But this should also be accompanied by far bigger proposals and changes, including just like thinking of social change and social social change and political change. So I think it will be a long process, but if we just only think of like very narrow solutions, I think we will never reach any kind of like satisfactory state. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think we're at time. So we'll close today. But thanks so much, Kiran, and thanks so much everyone for asking really engaging questions.